Trigger warning. This program contains discussions about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse as recounted by adult survivors from their childhood experiences. The purpose of this program is to promote healing among survivors of childhood sexual abuse, primarily with men. Some of these discussions, however, may trigger past trauma. This program also includes explicit language.
One boy saying it was his mother that was abusing him. He said, I didn't like it, but I didn't like vegetables either. Like, I didn't know. He said, if it was my uncle, I would have known that this was abuse because I got lots of uncles and it would have only been happening with one. But I only had one mother. I didn't know that this was wrong. Like, if you're, for example, in a grouchy mood or angry mood or feel like fighting, okay, like that's one of the signs that you've been triggered. Go back in your environment, go back in time a few minutes. What happened? What got you? What part of whatever environment you're in now might have reminded you of another bad environment? A lot of men cope through like getting involved with extreme sports or hypermasculinity or, you know, just excessive sexual relations with women or whatever, trying to prove they're still a man or, you know, experimenting to try and figure out who they are. Like, we would seize the physical evidence with the image of these boys being abused, and they were all over the internet, but yet we had zero reports of it. Like, in the general population, men are 3.5 times more likely to complete suicide. Men with known histories of child sexual abuse are 13.5 times more likely to complete suicide, and also 30 times more likely to die of what might be considered an accidental overdose. So
hello, I'm Craig, and welcome to A Conversation With, a monthly program devoted to education and healing from trauma caused by sexual abuse, presented by Voices Beyond Assault.
And I'm Lorbird. As most of us here today, Craig and I are also survivors of sexual abuse. Voices Beyond Assault presents these programs because we understand the men and women who suffer sexual assault are not always heard. We want to amplify their voices, empower them to heal, and provide the resources needed.
And as such, we would like to first remind you that this program will contain discussions about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, and may also include explicit language. While today's program puts a spotlight on the healing journey specific to men, sexual assault and abuse is prevalent among all human beings, and our programs are all inclusive.
Today, we have a conversation with the wonderful Dr. Kelli Palfy. Dr. Palfy began her career working in adult and youth corrections. After becoming a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, she assisted with the startup of the first integrated child exploitation unit, specializing in sex crimes committed against children internationally, where she also conducted undercover operations online.
After retiring from the police force, Dr. Palfy went on to obtain her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Alberta and is a trained trauma therapist, having a private practice focused on male survivors of sexual abuse. She's the author of two books, or a number of books actually. One is called Men Too: The Unspoken Truths About Male Sexual Assault, which is what we'll talk about mostly today, and her upcoming book series, Creating Personal Safety for Children, which will actually be a series that's coming out very soon, if it's not coming out right now. Dr. Palfy, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you for having me. Yes, that book series is out already. I have another one coming out, hopefully by September. Tell you all about it.
Where we're all looking forward to it, and hopefully we'll be able to get into that too. But let's talk about your book that you have behind you right now, titled Men Too, which is a play on the Me Too movement, as we can see on the poster. Kind of, how did you decide on this poster? How did you decide on this title? You know, there's a little bit of taking something that already exists and changing it. Was there some ruffling that existed there?
Yeah, I mean, this was early, you know, when I was writing, it was like 2018, right? So, you know, coming into that Me Too movement and stuff, I was just, you know, really wanting to draw awareness to men too. And it just kind of came to me one day, you know, I always kind of give God the credit. He dropped it into my head and I liked it. And I had a certain image in mind that I wanted for my picture, for my cover, and we just couldn't quite make it work. And we came up with this one and I liked it even more. So I just a work in progress, really, honestly. Yeah.
You didn't get any backlash for it from the Me Too movement?
It's funny. I've only ever had two people ever say anything critical towards the work I'm doing. And by the time I saw it, like hordes of other people had already defended me. I just read it and moved on, No, I really haven't had any.
I love the title, and that actually what jumped out at me right away when I first saw it. So we're really glad to have you on. So you wrote Men Too for survivors, professionals, and friends of male survivors. How do you know? It's a little. You're the first female we've actually had on our program that has dedicated her career to helping men who have suffered childhood sexual abuse or any abuse. So, how did you, being a female, find yourself wanting to become an expert in male sexual abuse?
Yeah, it was a bit of a process, to be honest. So in the early 2000s, as Lowen mentioned, I was seconded to help with the startup of the RCMP's first child sexual exploitation unit. And so, of course, we had everybody that we knew that knew anything about child abuse and trauma and whatnot come and speak to us. And one of the guest speakers was the first man to ever come forward about his abuse, and that I'm aware of anyways, and that kind of blew the lid off this. And that was pro hockey player Sheldon Kennedy. He'd played for the Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings, Calgary Flames. And so he came and gave us a private lecture. And so at that time, we were just starting up the unit. And we were, of course, inundated with very, very large files, especially technically, like just a lot of images. We had actually started up our unit in response to the US Department of Homeland Security had taken down a server and identified a bunch of people from the US and Canada who had purchased child pornographic images. So we were assigned all of those people based on their credit card numbers that were in Canada. And I think there was 350 of them. So starting up right away, we had a huge file already. Sheldon Kennedy came and talked about his abuse. And I just remember that it broke my heart hearing his story. He talked about specifically why he hadn't talked about his abuse. And he said things like he felt like he was a junior hockey player when he was being abused by his coach. And he said he felt like the parents of his teammates knew but did nothing. And that just enraged me. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Some parent would put their own child's career ahead of a child's safety, And to be quite frank, I've had that validated in the last year. I spoke about that at a conference, and two men came up to me and he said, yeah, we knew. So I was like, holy crap, But yeah, so he talked about his reasons for not coming forward, and they were all very valid. Like I mentioned, he felt like some people knew already. And he said also that his parents were living in poverty, and his career was sort of a way to help get his parents out of poverty. And, so he kind of took on that responsibility, so to speak. It also,
Did you say his parents knew what was going on also?
no,
Or
they didn't know,
but
but
the other parents,
the other parents knew, yes.
wow, amazing.
His parents, I've since read his book again, and his parents were fighting, I think, and then just dad was a workaholic, lived in poverty, And he also said, it was like his hockey career, right? Like his coach, who was also his means to get to the NHL, was his abuser. So it was kind of like, it's like, do I give all of this up to stop this? And also he just felt like there was no supports for men too. So I just remember that it really gutted me. It just broke my heart. And I remember just being so motivated, like I want to do more for this guy. Because as Lowen said, I'd been in corrections before, and I remember thinking, like, why are there so many men in prison compared to women? Because I'd grown up around some pretty awful women, to be honest, and it just didn't make sense. Like, I don't see guys as any worse than women, like, why are there so many men in prison? And I would say God just turned the lights on, because I just realized there are literally no supports for men, like none. It's not even safe for a man to disclose. And I just remember it really gutted me, and I felt really bad that I couldn't do more. And then fast forward maybe a year, we took on it was the RCMP's first, what we refer to as sex tourism. So a Canadian that would travel abroad to, say, a third world country for the purposes of exploiting a child. So we got our first file of that nature, and I was the file coordinator. And to be honest, we had, again, the file was just massive. We had, I can't remember, like 65 different victims, 30 crime scenes in 3 different countries. Everything was in Spanish. It was overwhelming. And we were, you know, we'd presented this case to Crown. We'd gone through everything and, you know, laid out all the different charges we could lay, and Crown said, oh, the public can't handle that. You know, you need to pare it back. And so my bosses said, well, don't worry about the boys. And to be honest, I didn't question it at that time. Sorry, guys. But I was like, you know, because, you know, they were running around looking like they were enjoying it. You know, I mean, I was naive. And then thank God after I got convicted about that decision, the fact that I didn't even question it. And so I ended up leaving the Mounties because of bullying and stuff like that. And selfishly, it was a little bit of my own way out of my own depression, because, you know, I couldn't do that work anymore, which felt so important. And I was like, you know, what am I going to do with my life now, right? And I always say God just kind of dropped that reminder into my life about how I really wished I could do more for men. So during my master's, one of my professors at U of A mentioned that he worked at this place called the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse. And I just clung to him. I marched down there. I applied. I got accepted.
Every bit of information I can grab for you. I'm looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I did a 1-year practicum there. And then I think I stayed on another year just because I wanted to learn more and, you know, just kind of be able to access all their training and all the places where they weren't for training. And so then I decided to do my PhD and put the pitch out there to U of A that, you know, this is way bigger than most people think, and most people don't know about it. And yeah, and decided to do my research on why boys and men were not reporting their sexual abuse, because we knew that it was happening based on that file and other files, you know, but yet when we look at our own indices checks, there was no reports of them. Like, we would seize the physical evidence with the image of these boys being abused, and they were all over the internet, but yet we had 0 reports of it, like less than 10% out of all of the files that we had. So it wasn't proportionate at all, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, so then I decided, okay, this is like I said, tiny bit selfish. I needed something I needed something meaningful, and purposeful. And honestly, I thought about it and I was like, well, men can't criticize, or women can't criticize me for standing up for men, and men aren't going to criticize me for standing up for them. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's a really cool niche, honestly. And I just, yeah, doing my own research, like my PhD took me 6 years, but it was the absolute highlight of my career so far, just like what I learned, and, you know, writing the book after. So my book is most of my research results are in the book.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, which is basically meant to educate the general public. Like, it's for anybody. I know my editors and my book coaches hated that. I was like, well, I just want to teach people about the fact that this is way bigger, because the way I looked at it was like, I was supposed to be the expert and I didn't know this. So if I'm the freaking expert and I don't know this, and, you know, it's for a lot of reasons, because, you know, 20 years ago, the last person talking about male sexual abuse was the victim, right? So how do you know about it if nobody talks about it? So for the last 20 years, I have just been making it my mission to talk about this and create awareness. And yeah, just so the book's meant to support male survivors and to educate other people about male sexual abuse and the reasons they don't talk about it, the consequences, the way they cope, that kind of stuff.
Well, we really appreciate all the work you're doing, and it was an easy read, I have to say, and I like the little sections that you will stop occasionally and kind of give a view from a psychological standpoint, and then go back into the story. I think it was really laid out well.
Thank you. Yeah, I get 2 responses. People either love it or they're like, I couldn't read it. So it's usually one of the 2 extremes.
Dr. Palfy, you touched on so many interesting ideas. You talked on the proliferation of abuse through technology, the distribution of that. You touched on this idea of a certain amount of culture and disdain for, we can let that pass by. You touched on a certain amount of like obligation this hockey player felt of like bearing that burden. All of those are so interesting, but I kind of wanted to circle back to like this specific story of this specific player, of this specific idea of, I bear an obligation to my family to like help them, to support them, and how that has led to ultimately his silence. I'm like, I need to do what I need to do to
Mhm.
get where I want my family to be. It's
Mhm.
just like, it's such a heartbreaking idea. And I see
Mhm.
that play out in a lot of people where they're like, if I tell my family, it'll break them. And I have to
Yeah.
like provide for them.
Yeah. So, and that was something that played out in my research too. Basically boys doing what they're trained to do as men, protecting the family, protecting the sense of family. Like if I, for example, report dad who's abusing me, there goes the sense of family. Who's going to pay for groceries? Who's going to pay for university? That kind of stuff. Or if I report the guy from, like, I had a lot of people who had reported, or participants who reported that the abuse had occurred, for example, in their dad's church, and they're like, well, this is my father's church. Like, what's it going to do to the reputation of my father if I disclose this? Or other ones that were raised in families where there was another child with like emotional needs based on their early traumas. And, if I disclose this, it's going to be too much for them. Mom and dad already have too much on their plate, or, just that kind of stuff. The reputation of their parents, this idea that it's too hard for my parents, they couldn't handle it, the whole sense of family, keeping it together. So definitely, being little men, unfortunately, right? It's a big burden.
Yeah. And I guess my question to you, I guess, is like, what word of encouragement would you give, a piece of advice of like, obviously we don't want you to say
Mhm.
nothing, right? We
Yeah.
want you to speak up. We want you to share your story. But also, we can't completely ignore the fact that there will be things that will crumble and fall and break. And
Yeah.
so if someone was like, Dr. Palfy, this thing happened to me, but I feel these obligations and I feel this duty. How do I go about this? Is there,
And you know what? I do see that, honestly, even as adults, like I can't tell my parents about this because it'll break them. I don't know. I still think like a police lady, I guess, where like if we all stay silent, these guys just get away with it, and that's worse in my mind, right? And I literally I'm writing another book called Speaking the Truth in Love. It's going to be a mother's guide to keeping her son safe, and that's the one that's hopefully coming out by September. But yeah, I do talk about ways to talk with people, like literally I give you something, a way you could bring it up, right? Like because research shows people don't change if they don't know how to change. So just this idea that, for example, if it was your parent and you knew it was going to be something that would be hard for him to hear, I would start with that. I would say, look, I got something to tell you. It's going to be hard for you to hear. It's going to be hard for you to believe. Like, can we set aside a time when you're going to be in a good headspace? I'm obviously speaking from the point of a adult, or an older child, but yeah, just sort of, kind of warming them up. Like, for example, I've had other clients that have told me they got high or drunk and then made their disclosures, which ended really badly because unfortunately that parent thinks that it's just a consequence of the substance, which is usually, honestly, the truth is that the substance is what they use to build their courage up. So it's nasty, right? So um, I would say if it's too hard to talk to your parents, talk to another trusted adult and get them involved, get them to help support you and, if necessary, your parent.
All right. Well, let's take a step back a little bit, and you're our first Canadian resident who is as a guest, and a lot of people think, well, Canada is, and I know better, but Canada is the same as the U.S. It's not really. Have you discovered or uncovered any differences in the way male sexual abuse survivors are viewed in Canada versus the U.S.? And I'm thinking that maybe there's even more of a masculinity identity in among males in Canada than the US. I don't know. Have you found that at all?
I mean, I don't know that I mean, I've never seen any research on that, but I do think there are a lot more supports for men in the US, to be honest. Like there's different like big agencies, malesurvivor.org being one of the ones that I don't know how active they are now, not super, super active, but that's been a big resource for men around the world. And yeah, I do think, just exactly what you said, that Canadian men might not be as open to talking about this and stuff. But again, like, I want to say in the US, you have a lot more of these agencies where, people are going after the offender.
Yeah.
Like, God bless you guys, like that's awesome. So, I mean, all those things help like shed light on this, right?
Well, and your example of the hockey player, and then there was a hockey player, another hockey player just recently. And when people think of hockey players, they think of them as the epitome of the male, you know,
Yeah.
vision. And oh my gosh, how could it happen to a male hockey player? That it had to be even more courageous for that hockey player to come forward.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is I just reread his book. I realized I hadn't actually read it, so I sat down and read it. I think it took me a day and a half, maybe 2, 3 months ago, and just hearing his story, because I remember I was a police lady at the time, and he was coming across Canada, and it was like, yeah, we want to support this guy. This is so awesome. And then all of a sudden, you hear he crashed his Hummer into a power pole, and it's like, oh, is this guy legit or what? But you read his story, and he was talking about how, he hated the pressure that the public put on him. He's like, I'm not a hero. I just broke the silence. Stop looking at me like I'm so fixed. Stop looking at me like I got it all figured out. Like like honestly, I think he went and got drunk because the pressure just got to him. Everybody was like, what do we do about this? You have to heal us. You have here's my story. He went across Canada listening to people's stories. And my goodness, like as a trained trauma therapist, that's a lot. So
Yeah.
yeah, that on
Wow.
top of it,
Interesting.
This leads perfectly into our next kind of question we have for you. And it's kind of this like double life that male survivors will live. On the
Mhm.
outside, he's going out, he's speaking up, he's sharing his story, but then internally he's really struggling. And he's like, I'm not the savior, I'm not the messiah. Like, stop looking at me for all your answers. I'm just someone who spoke up. And you kind of expand on the idea of the double life and how it also affects the relationships that one has for male survivor. Could you touch on both of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And that honestly was one of the pieces that I related to because, at the time when Sheldon was giving his lecture, I was sitting there next to my corporal who honestly, I'd met him on a dating site, refused to date him, and now he's my boss. You can imagine how that played out, right? And I was being bullied by my boss above him, and it was just gross, right? So, I mean, like at work, I was like barely holding it together. By the time I'd get out the door, I'd be bawling my eyes out. But then I'm in major crimes. I'm like in the child exploitation unit, like I'm teaching, I'm assisting other agencies. So, I had this facade, right? Like about a false confidence kind of thing, right? He mentioned Messiah. Yeah, that's what got me out of that. I got in touch with my faith. But yeah, a lot of men cope through like getting involved with extreme sports or hypermasculinity or just excessive sexual relations with women or whatever, trying to prove they're still a man or experimenting to try and figure out who they are, right? So yeah, like inside there could be a really big sense of turmoil, whereas outside they're presenting as I was, as best I could, that everything was just great. So that, like, yeah, when I could really relate to that piece. I honestly think that's what caught my attention so much, was because when he talked about how he had to hide it and how he coped, I was like, man, that's me. I'm like coping through athletics. I used to say it would take I did Ironman Canada, which is like a ridiculous big triathlon, right? And I was like, no, this is good. Like I need 6 hours on the bike before I'm in a good mood, right? So I just could relate to that. And now I feel like I just see it everywhere when you see people doing these extreme things or whatever. It's like, yeah, what are you running from? Because I was. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that totally expands on the idea of the double life. And then could you expand on that idea as it impacts male survivors' relationships? I think that's
Yeah, honestly, and kind of like it could be from one extreme to the other, where somebody's like, decompensated and coping through using substances and stuff like that, or a high achiever, because like oftentimes even just the distraction of work helps them cope, right? Like if I can just focus on this, I don't have to think about that. So if they're successful at this, they can be like really high achievers. So yeah, and a lot of it is about avoidance of thinking about these things, avoidance how it affects a relationship, avoidance through excessive work, avoidance through engaging in all these excessive masculine sports and stuff, but also an avoidance of intimacy, right? Because a lot of people will say that, they avoid getting totally intimate emotionally with somebody because they don't want to accidentally disclose, or they don't want pity, or they don't want their partner to look at them as, less of a man or something like that. So yeah, definitely all it surprised me, honestly, the overachiever part, but yeah, like a couple of the guys that I interviewed for my research said, just threw themselves into school in part because they wanted to create, their abuse was happening at home and they wanted to create a better life for themselves. So yeah, it's really, I mean, I wish there was, one towel where we could just go after everybody in that one area and say, hey, we want to support you, but it's so broad. And that's one of the things that I really talk about in my next book, is just like, how to, like, all the different ways guys cope and all the different parts of the puzzle that can be contributing or making a boy or man not want to come forward, and just like warning signs across all the platforms.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and it's not like one size fits all. It's all over the board. Everybody thinks, well, it should be just the same experience for each one, and that's what makes it difficult, doesn't it? And one of the things, I love your website where you have all of the videos that you're talking about in different segments. That was great, and everybody should check that out. One of the things you talk about is gender bias, and we talked a little bit about that earlier in this program. But can you expand a little bit on the impact that gender bias has on male victims of sexual assault? And is it specific for men? It doesn't happen for women, or what?
Well, I mean, I think that's what caught my attention, aside from the double life too, but like back in the early 2000s when Sheldon Kennedy was talking to us, just this idea, I became aware of this idea that, there's all kinds of supports for girls and women, right from infancy. We're allowed to cry, we're allowed to go to our mommies, we're allowed to seek support, we're allowed to talk to our girlfriends. Men are given messages, suck it up, don't cry, the only emotion you're allowed to feel is anger. I mean, that's changed, thank God, but 20 years ago that was definitely the case, right? Like, if men cried, you'd be considered a sissy. Now thankfully I know better. That's a sign of incredible strength if you can let that happen. But I thought that way, that's the way everybody else thought, and I honestly think that's a part of why I got involved in this work too, like my own conviction about my own stupid attitudes before, like. But yeah, so gender biases, yeah, like women, there's been like supports for them their whole life, whereas men, there's just, the only support there is the bottle of Jack Daniels or the pub or whatever, and substances and athletics or something like that, where you can go take your anger out on each other physically. But I mean, that doesn't work, right? It just builds your anger when you pump that anger. You have to be able to release the sadness and the hurt too, not just the anger.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I think it's very true that I know when I was in college and I was going through my own story, my response was like to hyperachieve. I was like working all day, every day. My friends would joke about like how many hours of sleep I would get. And I was just like, I'm trying to build this life. And I think I so deeply felt I don't feel like I really have a space to share my story. I don't feel like there's really an avenue for this. And thankfully, like eventually something came to be. Are there other kind of factors that are impacting male survivors in their ability to keep silence, apart from the ones we've kind of already touched on? We've touched on like this obligation, this duty, this cultural bias, this the way that we're raised. Is there anything else that you kind of want to touch on here?
Oh, there's so many things. Honestly, that was like my whole research, right? But as you talk, like what really comes to mind too, and you might be able to relate to this, Loan, and I'm sorry you went through that. Um, but honestly, even just a man, because of the gender biases, because of the messages that say, suck it up, you always want sex anyways, it's no big deal, like men never turn down sex, men can always control their erections, like those gender biases that exist in Hollywood or are perpetrated by Hollywood and the media and stuff like that. So, I mean, those forces all really contribute to what I would just refer to as like a victim's lack of awareness of how much it affected them too, right? So you might not have understood, for example, why you were so driven to work 2 or 3 jobs. Maybe you just thought you didn't want to be broke, but if you really step back, you'd be like, actually, what I don't want to do is go to bed and think. I don't want to have nightmares. It's not safe to fall asleep because that's where my abuse happened. All those reasons, right?
Yeah, that's like very, very true for me. I was like, if I'm working, I'm surrounded by coworkers, and if I'm surrounded by coworkers, I'll probably be more safe. And if
Yeah,
I'm working and I'm busy and I'm exhausted, I won't have to think about anything. And so I
right.
definitely have seen that. And I think the thing that's fortunate for me is now I'm a little bit more keen to that. Where if I see a
Yeah.
friend who's like starting to like start creeping towards like overworking themselves and doing a lot of different things and not really having a focus to that direction, I'm just like, let's catch up. Let's see what's going on there.
Good for you. And honestly, like it's exactly guys like you talking about it that make it safe for other men to come forward. So God bless you for doing that. Honestly, that's awesome.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that we do this program, and it's one of the reasons that we have Lorwood and I doing it, because honestly, I took 35 plus years to come forward and break my silence and tell my story. And Lorwood was much quicker than that, and I think that's a result of how far things have come and how far the ability, not saying it was easy for you, Lorwood, to come forward, but it was easier. I
I
should
would
say it
definitely
was.
say that it was easier. And when
Yeah.
I hear stories from others about, oh, I was this old and it took me 30 years, 40 years. My kids still don't even know, or my wife
Yeah.
still doesn't even know. And I'm
Yeah.
like, man, I turned it around in 4 years. And that's largely a result of everyone who has been doing work, individuals such as yourself, doctor, where they're like, hey, these things exist and these things are hard for people. We want to provide resources and we want to build that awareness for people so that they're able to come forward. And yeah, this kind of went in a different direction than I was expecting, but we appreciate individuals such as yourself who are doing
We
that
can
sort of work,
yeah,
bringing
we
that
can
to
take the
light.
light off you if you want. Yeah. Yeah.
So I do want to talk about, you spend a lot of time helping us understand perpetrators, which is always a scary thing, right? So like, when you are a survivor, you're like, well, why do I need to understand the perpetrator? I don't want to, get in their heads, they're the terrible people. But why do you think it's important that we understand the perpetrators?
First off, Craig, thank you. That's very interesting for me to hear because I've never really considered it from the victim's point of view. I always kind of think about it from like, pre-abuse, not post-abuse. But I think it's important because, we naturally blame ourselves for things that happened. One thing I like to say to a lot of my clients is that be careful not to judge yourself then as if you know what you know now. And you guys can probably both relate to that, right? Like back then, I didn't know this. And I mean, I know it now, but back then I didn't know this. So be careful not to judge yourself as if you knew all that stuff then. So by teaching victims about, for example, the elaborate, extensive amount of effort and process that offenders put on grooming themselves, grooming their environments, grooming their victims, can help a victim feel less responsible, feel less, stupid or whatever they might be saying to themselves, right? Because, I mean, when you realize this fellow really literally went to university with the sole purpose of getting an education degree and becoming a basketball coach so that he could have access to boys, like how much effort did he put into that, right? And like, understanding, for example, the fact that they don't offend against everybody, they pick 1 out of 30 or something like that. So you've got 29 other people who will swear rightfully that the guy had never touched them. It makes you look like a liar. But when you understand that that's part of their process, it can be helpful, right? Because like, why does everybody think I'm lying? Well, it's part of the grooming process. It's purposeful. They create alibis. That's what happened in the Michael Jackson case, right? He had a couple alibis he didn't offend against,
Hmm.
who, probably are not lying.
Yeah, that's it. That is it. And by the way, and if you get a chance, we did a program with Wade Robson that would be very interesting for you to see as well.
Yeah, I watched that Living Neverland series. Very good, yeah.
Speaking of coaches, one of the men you interview for your book, you call Aaron, is from a stable family, was abused by his coach. Is it a fallacy on the side of people who are viewing occurrences to assume that anyone who is a male victim immediately comes from an unstable home environment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned in my book, every young child has a vulnerability. Offenders will work to figure out what that is and to target it and to exploit it. So yeah, I mean, even like, for example, kids growing up in affluent houses, well, lots of times parents work really hard and more than one job to be affluent, or they're gone or whatever. So that child's lonely, that coach offers to fill that void. Next thing you know, he's subject to abuse. So yes, it can happen on every socioeconomic status, race, religion. And, in the last, say, 10 years, we're hearing more and more about abuse in different countries where it's like, oh, you always suspected it, but people weren't coming forward. And now the reports are just coming in. So it's every culture, it's every race, religion, gender.
Well, you talked to 13 men in the book, and I think 14 if you include
Yeah.
Jacob. I don't know if Jacob was he's at the start of the book. How did you find them? How did you get them to participate then? Because had to be a little difficult. And then how did you get them to open up like that?
Actually, I put up a poster at a conference. I put posters up around Edmonton and went to like the sexual assault centers and asked them to ask their clients, and that's what happened. And then I went to like some of the conferences for male survivors and training workshops and stuff like yourself, right? You're there teaching, supporting other male survivors. I'm like, hey, you tell me your story. Like, Lowen, tell me your story. And then I analyzed it. So yeah, like spent probably a whole year analyzing. There was 14 men. I had to exclude one because the basis of my research was that you had to have waited a year, and he didn't. He told somebody the next day, which is wonderful, but it excluded him from my research. So, but his story was interesting because he was the only adult that was abused as an adult by a female. So I should probably like do a blog about that someday or something. Cause yeah, like he had broken up with his girlfriend and, she'd moved out of the house or whatever. And he woke up in the middle of the night and she was on top of him. So, and he was like, get away. Like, this is not consensual.
Wow, interesting. And people think that can't happen.
Oh,
And
yeah, absolutely it does.
yeah, I think there's a TV series. I was just at an event the other night with there was somebody from the BBC, and he was telling me that he's part of a show called Reindeer. Baby Reindeer, and he produces that show. And I'm like, yeah, I haven't seen it, but that's exactly what we're talking about here. That could happen as an adult as well, right?
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to check that out myself. Yep.
You also spend some time talking about male survivors, their reluctance to see themselves as victims. How does that reluctance impact their ability to heal from what had happened to them?
It's huge, honestly, because they will just look at themselves and say, like, why are you such a mess? Like, oh, I can't remember what was his name in my book, but he had been in therapy I can't remember. Josh in my book. He had been in therapy for 6 years, and he was like, we couldn't understand why we were making such little progress, right? He had repressed his memories of his own abuse, and once he started to remember them, then he did way better. But yes, like this reluctance to see yourself as having been abused, we tend to naturally then just say, well, like, instead of saying you were like coerced and abused, a man might be calling himself stupid or an idiot, or, questioning his own sexuality because, like, why did I enjoy this guy? Obviously, even though they might forget how traumatized they were when the actual abuse took place, those memories of how much they liked their abuser kind of override that sometimes and just make them confused. So, and of course, like I talk about in this book, my next book that I'm writing, I talk about the grooming process. And part of it is that the offenders will use that sort of as evidence against them. They'll say, well, remember how well we get along together, and your body responded. Clearly, this is consensual. They try to paint this picture. So it adds to that confusion for a man about this idea of, was I willing participant or not? So Yeah, I mean, it definitely, and I'm like, if they're that confused, sometimes we just choose to want to forget about it or try to forget about it, right? So yeah, a lot of self-blame, a lot of guilt, and maybe some displaced anger. If we don't get to, give the anger sort of in the appropriate direction, we naturally turn it back on ourselves. So definitely a reluctance to recognize would have a huge impact on male survivors.
Yeah, let's talk about grooming because you do give a lot of insight into grooming. You actually put together a list in your book. It felt like you were giving away the perpetrator's secrets, honestly, because I don't know
Right?
how you found out all this information, but you put together this list that I feel like should be plastered in every school and every
Me too. And it's literally in my next book. That's what I'm writing about. So my next book is going to be called Speaking Truth in Love, A Mother's Guide to Keeping Her Son Safe. And yes, one whole chapter is just on grooming. I broke it down into 10 stages, and it's based on what, like, when I was in the child exploitation unit, I've had to sit and watch one offender's. I watched the whole process of him grooming. It was actually girls he groomed, but I just saw the progressive stages of how he got to where he was at. And then, when I hear my victims' stories about how their offenders lured them in or how they got involved with their offenders, and just like client reports and other research and stuff like that, I just kind of put it together. So yes, there is a free series on my website about grooming. I don't need to make money at any victim's expense. I want the perpetrator's techniques to be exposed. And they're by no means exhaustive, but at least it gets
Sure.
people thinking the way they need to be thinking in order to prevent abuse.
So the grooming, there is a lot of stages. It doesn't necessarily have to be that all of those things happen before you know that. It can be just one or two of those things, right? It doesn't have to be the
Yeah.
entire list. And it's a little scary because just because somebody's doing some of the things that you see doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to follow. So it's meant to be things that people should look out for. Can you hit on a couple of those grooming um, things on your items on your list that you think are most prevalent or most scary and indicative of a potential abuse that people should look
Yeah,
for?
absolutely. And one of the biggest red flags would be anytime an older youth or adult is trying to separate one person from the pack. That would be the biggest red flag in my mind. So if, it could be subtle too. It's like, oh, he's got this injury. I'm worried about this injury. It needs extra massage or extra ice time. Take him off alone into that back room. Or, hey, you're the best hockey player. I'm gonna go to the game this weekend, but it's in a different city, so why don't you come with me and we'll just talk about your strategy. Like, always trying to exclude one, or remove one child from the pack or teenager, whatever. Just any opportunity for them to be alone is when we want to have like huge concern. Yeah, even if it seems like it's, honestly, another red flag would be like if it seems too good to be true. Like, not too many adults are going to offer to take one child, away to, because he's this amazing child and I'll pay for everything because I just believe in this child so much. I mean, every parent wants to be able to believe in their child, but of course offenders are going to exploit that, right? So they're gonna, yeah. So another red flag that I talk about in my book is, for example, the volunteer that tries to fill every gap or tries to make organizations bend the rules. Like, for example, a lot of organizations are getting more aware of this, and they could put a rule in place, for example, that no volunteers alone with a child. There always has to be two volunteers or maybe two children or something. I'm not sure exactly how they always work it, but the volunteer that tries to say, well, oh, we just got to do this because of that, like trying to bend the rules. For example, a volunteer who's got lots of moves under their belt, lots of times they will move when if they're starting to get suspicious that maybe the gig's up, maybe they've been found out, or maybe a child is getting close to report. So they might just get out of there because, a lot of times parents, honestly, they'll just say, well, he moved away. It's, we don't have to worry about it now. The threat is gone, that kind of stuff. Or if they're, offending against their own children, they will move the family because, oh, my son was starting to make too close of friends. He might accidentally tell. So let's just yank him up again and move him again so he's disoriented again. And
Well,
It's
that
just,
happened in the 80s when the church would move priests
yeah,
when they found out that they were molesting boys. They would
yeah,
just
yeah.
move them to another
Yeah.
parish.
Yeah, so right now I'm really working on trying to pare it down so it's not overwhelming, but there are so many things just to, I say in my book, like it's not like you said, Loan, it's not one thing. It's like if you got a cluster of them, okay, now you really need to pay attention. Or if you're seeing even just one of them, but your child is displaying either odd behaviors or withdrawing, that kind of stuff, or regressing developmentally, or got a chip on their shoulder. Okay, now we need to look a little deeper. What's going on, you know? And like, I was just thinking this last night and just circling back to what we talked about earlier, if a child doesn't feel safe telling their own parent, tell somebody else, just find somebody else to tell, right? You'll get support for yourself first, especially if they don't think their parents are going to believe them.
Mm.
Right? That is so big, right? Like if your parents shut you down, oh, that's brutal, right? Oh, it breaks my heart.
Yeah. So let's assume like you have a child. No one loves your child like a parent will love their child. I think that's really important to emphasize because some parents can have this rosy idea of, oh, like a teacher will care for my child the way that I care for my child. It's like the unfortunate reality is you are the best equipped parent to parent your child. And I think no one should take that from you. Um, you're with your child, you're starting to see some things that are concerning to you. What is, as a parent, as an adult, what is your appropriate reaction? Are you building a case? Are you going straight to higher level management to say, hey, something is happening? Are you talking to the kid? What's kind of your approach to things like this?
I mean, it depends on the environment and the stage too. And I mean, I would say first off, like let the child know you believe them. Okay, look, we need to talk about this more. Tell me what's going on. And if I say, like in my book, I talk about if for example, now is not a good time, tell the child when it's a good time. Like if I got to go to work and I got another child with me or whatever, and I literally can't. Okay, I'm gonna drop off your sister at school, then I'm coming back to pick you up and we're gonna talk about this, right? So make a specific time. Also keep in mind, like you're saying, like this is our child, or you think a teacher's gonna keep your child safe. Offenders will groom themselves, get themselves into those positions as teacher so that it looks like they can be believed over the child. It's really gross how much effort they put into offending, as you guys probably know.
Yeah, and that's why we need to shut down those opportunities. And I know that the
Absolutely.
Catholic Church has spent a lot of effort into shutting that down, and then because they look for whatever opportunity they have. The Boy Scouts of America had an issue. They have to make major changes to their the way they vet people and the way they control people and things like that. So it's the more we can spread the awareness of this list, and the more we can look at things that are on this list that you can prevent, for like people being
Yeah,
alone with the kids and stuff,
yeah,
I think
yeah,
the better
yeah.
it's going to be. As we said, you interviewed 13 survivors. The ages when they were first sexually abused, a lot of people would be surprised that it was between 2 and 16, and that's a large age spread. I think people think that a lot of abuse occurs when they're much younger, and it really was a big range. How common is it for the older kids to be sexually abused? Is that actually the age that you see, or is
Well,
it
I
just
mean,
everywhere?
I think we're seeing more and more of it. Like in my practice, I'm seeing more like female teachers offending against prepubescent boys or boys after they hit puberty. So that's a very big growing trend, unfortunately. Yeah, and I mean, I would say honestly, Craig, I was shocked at how, I mean, I knew that honestly from my days in working in the child exploitation unit, unfortunately. I had thought it was rare, but like I think it was 2 out of the 13 that I interviewed where their abuse began like really, really young. They don't even remember not being abused. So that really shocked me. And yes, yeah, I think even more and more now with like just all the date rape drugs and stuff like that, like it's common in older youth, it's common in adults. For example, especially, for a man maybe wanting to engage in a homosexual relationship, whether that be just strictly physical or meeting on a dating site or meeting at a hookup place or whatever, and then winding up, consenting to one thing, but being drugged or being threatened or being coerced or being bombarded or surprised or attacked, whatever you want to call it, and forced to do something else, kind of thing. So hearing stories of that as well, I'm not sure whether men are just reporting it more. I think that is definitely part of it, but I think we're also seeing more of it too, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably a true statement, that maybe hard to say if it's happening more or not, but definitely more reporting, which I think is good. But ultimately, the trend we want to see is nobody is reporting because nothing is happening.
Yeah. Yes, I love what you said, Craig, about just like exposing the perpetrators, like plans and actions. That's exactly my agenda.
Yeah.
That's a good agenda.
It's a good agenda. It's something important, something hopefully with Dr. Palfy's next book, we'll be able to expose more and more of that and get more of that out and into the light.
Yeah.
We touched on this a couple of times, how self-blame and this like self-directed hatred is so common among male survivors. Do you
Mhm.
find that the older a boy is when his abuse began impacts the depth of his feelings about having been able to stop it or prevent it?
Yeah, definitely, because excuse me, for example, like the boys who were abused from parental abuse, for example, from the early childhood, they can look at that and say, well, like I was a baby, like I didn't even know anything about anything. But they think, well, why didn't, as you get older, boys will judge themselves, well, I mean, I knew about that, I should have known about that, I should have figured it out, kind of thing. So absolutely, yeah, it can definitely impact how they feel about themselves, for sure.
And all of the people you interviewed, all but one was abused more than once, which I was surprised at. So, and all but one were abused by more than one person. So why do you think this happens? Is this a question of re-victimization? Are I used to feel like I had a stamp on my head that said, I'm a victim, come get me. Is it a question of why is this happening more than once to men and with more than one person abusing them?
Yeah, I'm just making notes to make sure I touch on these points. Well, there's a few different things that could be at play there, right? For example, going back to this idea of how much effort offenders put into gaining access to their victims. They're organized. They will actually introduce each other and set each other up, like, share victims, so to speak, which is horrible. But yes, they'll have their time of abusing a victim and then invite a third party in or drop the kid off to spend the weekend with that person or something. It's terrible. So that's definitely part of it. Another part of it is like when you've been abused, you can often struggle with boundaries. And of course, offenders are watching for that, right? What kid has boundary issues? What kid has a need? A child that's already been abused is, probably got some more vulnerabilities that the next offender will pick up on and exploit. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on there, right? But I mean, I've heard some of my participants and clients have said, the exact same thing. Like it was like I had a stamp on my forehead. But like I said, offenders will watch for vulnerability. They'll smell it. They'll go after it like a rabid dog. So, and every child has needs, right? These offenders are working really hard to fill whatever your particular need is. And then next thing you know, like, the whole part of the whole grooming process, because that child is having the need met, whether that, oftentimes it's a need for affection or even basic necessities of life in some cases, right? So, mom and dad can't quite put food on the table, and I can't ask them for money for hockey gear, but this guy's paying for my hockey gear and I can have a steak dinner and a potato if I go over there for dinner. I'll be in good headspace for my game, that kind of thing. And then the abuse doesn't necessarily always happen right away. Lots of times it's after a very well established caring relationship. So there's that piece too.
Yeah. You touched on something that I want to ask you about. You said people who suffer abuse struggle with boundaries.
Oftentimes.
And if you struggle with boundaries, you keep struggling unless you're able to reestablish this for yourself identify what is okay, what is not okay. How would you kind of help someone reestablish those boundaries for themselves of what is appropriate, what is not? Because this is something I personally struggle with, where I'm like, I felt very much like people always need to have access to me. I always need to be available. I always need to be ready to like give, to be ready to serve. But like, that is just not healthy. You know, you
No,
get
I
very exhausted. And
yeah.
so how do you go about redrawing those in a manner that's helpful without being totally exclusive? You know, like,
Yeah,
that's a
I
big
think
question.
no, that's fine. I think honestly, yeah, sorry, and I go on rabbit trails sometimes. My apologies, but yeah, I think honestly, first and foremost, learning about boundaries, right? There's a bit of a cross section between boundaries, identity, and trust, right? So it's really important to learn like what are boundaries, what are the different types of boundaries. Like for example, I really never used to think of time as a boundary, but now I'm very aware of it, right? When people think like I kind of have to control myself when people think they can just have unlimited access to you or what have you, like you say, and you know, you can grow weary doing well too, right? You know, so so you know, being allowed to say no for the purposes of self-care, that kind of thing, like you know, so yeah, I refer people to Dr. Henry Cloud. He's done a lot of work on boundaries. He's got a lot of books, a lot of courses, um, including his book Necessary Endings, which is like how to get somebody out of your life if you need to, basically, right? And yeah, I mean, especially as Christians, we're taught we're not supposed to, you know, we're always supposed to say yes and always supposed to be servants to people, but to what point, right? You know, like there has to be healthy boundaries too.
Not all the men you interviewed were abused by other men, and we talked about that this can happen from women as well. Are the impacts of sexual abuse any different when the perpetrator is a woman versus another man? And how about it when it's their own mother? I mean, this is, you know, people think this is impossible, but it does happen, and it has happened to some of the people in your book.
Yeah, definitely I would say the impacts are different because, you know, especially like you look at Hollywood, all these messages about how every time there's a offer for sex, men should be so excited to take it, right? Boys will look back at their own abuse and, you know, for example, in their mind, if they know they didn't enjoy it, they'll be shaming themselves because they should have, or if they yeah. Sometimes they will disclose to a friend, and that friend will say, "Oh, you're lucky," and they think, "Well, you know, I guess I'm looking at it the wrong way." So they might even get mad at themselves or try to rewrite their own abuse stories, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think, for example, Hollywood has perpetrated so much confusion for boys and men in this area that, you know, they're always supposed to be willing anytime it happens, you know, especially if their body responds, it means they were willing participants, and that's just not the case. Um, and especially if it's a mother, they will really, really question, like, what the hell's wrong with me? Why did my body respond like that? And I would just say your body's responding the way God designed it to respond. It's designed to respond to touch. Like your penis has a brain of its own, unfortunately, you know. So yes, definitely it has a different impact. You know, if it's a woman, it can unfortunately have the impact that it will turn a young man away from women and make them think that they want to only be with men. If it's a man, it could make them think that, oh, this is what I like, whereas that might not have been the case before the abuse, right?
So it really screws around with their sexuality, their identity, their sexual identity as well.
It can. It doesn't always, but it can for sure.
Just as another piece of confusion amongst trying to figure everything else out. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure disassociation is a common occurrence among any sexual abuse victim, and it can be, you know, your body's trying to survive. It's trying to remove yourself from that. But in the same way that it can be a survival mechanism, is it also potentially like a destructive mechanism as well?
Definitely can be if you come to rely on it. So, yeah, during the abuse, it could help keep you alive for sure. but people often will kind of purposely dissociate, the whole avoidance thing. And it might be through substances. So yes, of course, it could become pathological, a problem of its own, right? And, with children, they don't necessarily know that they're doing that, but a child might, for example, develop this whole fantasy life, where they've got make-believe friends and stuff. And sometimes it can become hard for them to differentiate between what's real and what's not real at that point. But yeah, so
Yeah.
dissociation, good in the short term. Long term, we want to be able to have other coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I think, when I think about my own abuse, I was, when it was happening, I would feel like I was outside of my body, out in another place, not even in my body. And that can be a very good survival mechanism while it's happening, because that's how you get through it. But then you also have those skills that go on after the abuse, and it can be negatively impacted.
Yeah, I think your brain could easily slip down that track as a means to cope with everything, or and maybe even to the extent where when we talk about lack of boundaries, you may put yourself in vulnerable positions because you're having another one of your needs met, knowing that you can dissociate, right? And that's obviously very unhealthy.
So what are some of the other ways you found that children, when they get abused as children, are affected emotionally when they become adults, other than maybe having a dissociation problem or things like that? I know you had one of your people had multiple personalities that they would talk to and have and maintain. What are some other ways that it can permeate itself in adulthood?
Yeah, actually, 3 of my participants developed dissociative identity disorder, but I did go to like a conference where I believe that my participants would have been on the more extreme end of trauma. So yeah, the avoidance, like we talked about, obviously, avoidance of intimacy, avoidance of even allowing themselves to succeed in life, right? Like if they're struggling with sense of self-worth, or they've had just the things that are taken from them when you're abused, they might not feel like they're worthy of, achieving great things in their career. So they could, unfortunately, maybe self-sabotage. I've definitely I working with a guy right now who got accepted full scholarship for PhD and didn't feel worthy. So he dropped out. Like that breaks my heart, right? Anger, right? You wind up with a lot of anger, whether it's anger towards women. I am convinced there's a huge link between male sexual abuse and domestic violence. I don't know how often that's been studied, but I think it's Jackson Katz has a quote, which is in my book, like when you take something from a boy, he's gonna, as a man, he wants to take that back. He grows up with this desire to take all that was taken from him back. So yeah, there's just so many ways. I would say that, the predominant ones are some of the ones that we've talked about, like whether it's engaging in extreme avoidance through excessive workaholism or athletics or anger or substance use or becoming avoidant, or, developing an extreme pathological response like DID or something like that.
Dr. Palfy, we touched on previously kind of the emotional toll that it takes on how it's difficult, the reasons why it's difficult, but you also kind of have this idea of emotional torment that men face, right? You talked about, when we look at the statistics, people who are going through abuse have higher likelihoods of suicide, higher likelihoods of overdose, higher likelihoods of engaging in risky behavior. Could you kind of expand on that idea a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the pieces of research that really caught my attention was out of Iceland, and it was 14 men that had been interviewed, and they had disclosed that their choice point was, I'm either going to kill myself or talk about this. So of course, that makes you beg the question, well, how many people never chose that option, right? So yeah, we know from, US statistics, I think it's the Center for Disease Control put up these statistics, but that men are, even without known histories of child abuse, in the general population, men are 3.5 times more likely to complete suicide. Men with known histories of child sexual abuse are 13.5 times more likely to complete suicide. and also 30 times more likely to die of what might be considered an accidental overdose. So those numbers are, in my mind, are very indicative. I would hope that we're going to see those numbers come down because of guys like you and what you're doing, like creating this awareness, creating acceptance, giving people like me a platform to share the knowledge that I have. By doing this, you guys make it safe for other boys and men to get support, and also for the women viewers to kind of go, okay, you know, maybe I need to not be thinking about this the way they am. Maybe I need to reassess. Maybe I need to step back. Maybe I need to step in, whatever the case may be. So, yeah.
You know, I'd like to explore what you call the process of normalization a bit. And that's making the perpetrator will make the child think that what there is happening with them, the two of them, is normal. And I wonder if that could also lead to those children to grow up and think that type of sexual behavior is normal as well. And we know that just because a male is abused does not mean they're going to grow up and be an abuser, but it could also mean other things, right? That they just think that sexual promiscuity is perfectly fine, or that sex with anybody that they, see. So can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great point, Craig, for why we need to teach our kids. Like, I mean, back when you and I were growing up, maybe, they took the approach like, we don't talk about those kinds of things. This is private, kind of like you'll figure it out, or they'll talk about it in high school, or you'll figure it out when you get there, kind of thing. We can't do that anymore in today's liberal society, right? Like, we have to be educating kids about things like masturbation, because if we don't talk to them about it and someone else does, they could be filled with false information, for example, that you need help learning how to do that, right? Like, so yeah, we need to, whether or not a parent agrees with that, kids need to know the truth about sexual matters and about their right to say no. And yeah, it is, you're right, there is, especially in childhood, you can see reenacting what's been done to them. Maybe, I don't know if I would necessarily call it perpetrating at that age, because a lot of times they're reenacting, trying to have a better experience of what happened to them, reenacting just because this is what is their norm, right? Because this is what they do in playtime at their house. So yeah, I think one of the best quotes out of my book was, one boy saying it was his mother that was abusing him. He said, I didn't like it, but I didn't like vegetables either. Like, I didn't know. He said, if it was my uncle, I would have known that this was abuse, because I got lots of uncles and it would have only been happening with one. But I only had one mother. I didn't know that this was wrong. And he was unfortunately one of the ones that it started quite young. So yeah, there is some research that shows that less than 10% in the normal population will go on to reoffend. I don't think that statistic is accurate in certain populations, like, in the First Nations, in some areas where, for example, their culture has been decimated and there is like more problems with substance abuse. Those numbers are much higher, but in the general population, they say it's less than 10% will go on to purposefully reoffend.
Yeah.
But if I could add, perpetrators will spread that myth that, if you were a victim, you will naturally be inclined to want to reoffend, because it's one of the reasons that boys and men stay silent. They don't want people thinking of them like that. Like, all of a sudden, I don't want you to be around my kids because you were abused, right? So
yeah,
it's very
that's actually one of the reasons people don't tell their story, don't come forward, is because they're worried about that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. At one point, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, like, more and more I'm hearing stories of like abuse victims becoming police officers or becoming social workers or becoming counselors because they want to prevent it, right? That's more naturally the response.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would 100% agree with that. It tends to be people that go through these experiences will be like, I know how much hurt it causes. I know how terrible it is, and I want to try and fix it and take on a little bit of that for myself.
Yeah. And Lauren, like, you kind of asked me, like, how did you as a woman get involved with this? Well, honestly, I'm not a male survivor, clearly, but I came from a pretty messed up background myself. Like, all of these things that I talk about in my book are are like, dissociation. Oh my God, I didn't recognize myself in the mirror until I was 27. I remember being jealous of people who knew who they were. And I didn't even understand. How can you be so confident about yourself? Like, I just didn't know who I was. And then when you learn about trauma and it's what happens, right? It's like, oh, now it all makes sense, right? So yeah, there is this sort of therapeutic component, obviously,
Yeah.
to understanding all this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just what happens to you, but it also happens to your body, right? And you talk about the memories of abuse can fade, but your body will remember. How does that happen? Because for me, I'm like, oh, like I remember something, it happens in my brain, but if my body remembers something, how does that get expressed?
How does that get expressed? Okay, for example, if you had a really horrible experience on April 15th, every April 15th, you could find yourself in a pissy mood or a low mood or something like that. So, we can get triggered by any of our five senses. So even though you might not be thinking about it, let's say your abuse, for example, happened unfortunately, on a nice night at the beach or something, right? Let's say you try to go to a nice sunset night at the beach, and it's not like, a scary situation or something, or not a bad situation. Your body could respond as if you were walking into danger just because of the feel of the air, the visual of the sunset, the feel of the wind, the smell of the ocean, because those were all present when you were abused. So your body will remember that. And then, so I want to do a male survivor workbook. I haven't got to it yet. Well, I haven't finished it yet. I've started, but like, I always teach, we have to look from all the different angles, right? So I would, for example, teach you to watch for when you're, like, if you're, for example, in a grouchy mood or angry mood or feel like fighting, okay, like that's one of the signs that you've been triggered. Go back in your environment, go back in time a few minutes. What happened? What got you? What part of whatever environment you're in now might have reminded you of another bad environment? So I teach kind of come at it from all the angles.
We talked about people disclosing, and that's an important part of starting the healing process. And you talked about when the best time, or find somebody that will listen, and if it's not their parents, find somebody else. But what about the person who's listening? What about the person on the other side of the story? What are the best ways for them to accept the story that they're hearing? Because it can be quite devastating to hear that your son or your best friend or your has experienced this, and they're coming forward to you.
Honestly, I would say do your very best to put your own emotions aside and be there for them at that point. Like, you can get your own support. Like, I have had that where mothers will come to me and say, oh my God, my son just disclosed this. And I will attend to them for a while. And then oftentimes they'll refer their son to me or whatever, something like that. But yeah, I would really recommend for the person who's receiving the disclosure, I mean, you can say things like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That must be awful. I'm not even sure what to say. What do you need? Like, who else knows about this? How can we all support you? Like, yeah, like all of those. I think just be really raw and really, really real with them, right? Like, I always just like be authentic, right? Like, I mean, not to the point where you're making them attend to you emotionally, but like, for example, I had somebody the other day, I worked with him when I was in university, when I was still going to university, and he called me back. It's been 15 years. He said, I just remember you were so authentic. He said, I remember once when I was telling you my story, he said, you got a tear in your eye, I could tell. And he said, but you didn't make it about you. And I honestly couldn't remember this guy for sure, but he was like, it just really touched me so much, because I do care. Like I say, he said, once you see my face, you'll remember me, and I'm sure I will. But just be that whole authentic piece, like he said, like just balance it somehow with being authentic, but not like, that's sort of like, for me, that's my rule in the sand. I try to be authentic without making them attend to me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And I mean, I don't kid yourself. Like, I got friends. I have one girlfriend where, like, the other day I was so upset. I had a client that was he dropped me, like, I mean, and I know I'm one of his only healthy supports, and I know when he gets really upset, he pushes people away, and he pushed me away, and he did it by text, so there was nothing I could do about it, right? And then I heard from somebody else that he got some really bad news, and now I'm really worried about him, and he's telling me he's fine, and I had someone else check on him, and he was really rude to them, so now I'm just like, I was a mess, and I called up a girlfriend. I'm like, I told her, like, anonymously kind of what happened, and she helped me have a quick cry, you know. She prayed for me, she prayed with me, and I just had to let it go, you know. I mean, because it got heavy, right? But so, yeah, I mean, I like, definitely in the moment, try to put your own emotions aside, but definitely deal with them afterwards, right? Like, don't bury your own emotions. So that's what I would recommend. Not always easy to do, though, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not easy and very, very difficult.
And I've had to catch myself too, where I start to make it about me, and then I go, wait, nope, 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 this is about you, you know? I mean, I'm not perfect, right?
Yeah.
I got my own history of trauma.
Yes, we're all learning and we're all progressing.
Yeah. But you know what? We're in the game, right? We're in the game.
Yep. We're on the field.
Yeah, the next generation can do it better based on our mistakes, right?
Exactly.
We're in the game. Unlike previous generations didn't talk about it at all. We're all treading on new territory here.
Yeah, we are. We've touched on this idea that for guys, there's this reluctance to seek help, a reluctance to see themselves as victimized, a reluctance to admit what had happened. You know, in your like research in your studies, do you see a specific modality as being the best way for men to get help, as being like, you know, rather than going directly to professional help, I think it's best if guys, you know, do X, Y, and Z first and then go there. Is there kind of a map you have charted out, or are you like, no, just go straight to the therapist?
No, and I would say it depends on the age too, right? But I mean, research does show that men are reluctant to talk about things they don't hear other boys and men talking about. So again, you guys being out here, a couple of dudes talking about this is exactly what men need. You know, the Terry Crews, big muscular guy, admitting he'd been abused. This is exactly what we need. So yeah, I would say, and you know, I have directed other clients, for example, go get your feet underneath you. Like if they're an adult and they're independent, for example, I might direct them, go check out the malesurvivor.org website. Go check out your podcasts. Listen to my hour-and-a-half lecture on grooming, you know, like process this stuff so you can, you know, at a moderate pace, right? So that you're not paying me $200 an hour all the time for what's already out there. And just so that you can have confidence and make sense of what's going on, right? Like, and get support, like from, you know, whatever you need, right? Because I don't always get it right. Like I've had clients correct me and say, no, that's not what I'm bothered by. This is what I'm bothered about. And, you know, by the second time they say it, I usually pick up on it if they've flat out and said, no, that's not an issue, you know? So yeah, I do like, you know, go listen to, here's a book, read my book. I lots of times, you know, I tell people to read my book first. Save, like, this is what I know about male sexual abuse. Go learn it for yourself for $25 instead of spending 8 months with me trying to go through all this stuff. Circle what's relevant to you and we'll talk about it. Yeah. So I do. Yeah. And other great books like the Bruce Perry book, What Happened to You? I love that. Like stuff like that.
Well,
Love town. Yeah.
I think so. I had a friend who didn't know my story or anything about me, and we were at dinner, and he was telling me that he was worried about his son, who's like 9, who loved baseball, and suddenly didn't want to go to the baseball anymore, and was saying all these things that like were throwing red lights to me. And so I said, well, have you asked your son about, you know, is there something that's uncomfortable, making him uncomfortable about being there? And he was also becoming introverted. He was staying in his room. He wasn't coming out and interacting with the family. And this is a scary thing for a parent, right? And so this kind of goes into your new series of books that that you've just are publishing. What are the most important ways to identify, to be concerned that your child may be, you know, we talked about the grooming signs, but that your child may be going through something that they should, because one of the things I think is most important in what we do, and I'm glad that you have a lot of other things, and I think it's great that we are covering a lot of these bases by these programs, but I think I don't want people to wait 35 years before they disclose. I want people to be all like Lorward, even sooner, even 30 minutes.
The next
Oh,
day.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I'm just looking
So
for
how do parents identify this, and what do they do when they see that, they think that their child might be having.
Well, yeah. I mean, like Craig, first off, thank you for saying that to him. I agree, you're bang on. There's some red flags there. One of the biggest red flags of a warning sign would be something like what you described there, extreme changes in behavior. Suddenly, you loved baseball last week. Why do you not want to go this week? You've loved baseball for 6 years. Why all of a sudden do you hate your coach, right? Or yeah, especially that now he's turning into an introvert. Ding, ding, ding. Huge red flag to me. That's a change in character, right? And unfortunately, a lot of parents are saying, oh, he is coming a teenager, or he's prepubescent or whatever. He's probably just going through the phase, right? No, extreme changes like that need to be addressed the way you said. Hey, did you ask about this, right? So yeah, there's like 2 chapters on that in my book. But yeah, other warning signs would be, yeah, I mean, I have blogs, like free blogs on my LinkedIn, and my next book is literally gonna have like 2 chapters on this exact subject. But because the difference, as in age, like in the really young children, they might be saying something like, "My tummy hurts," or having nightmares, or regressing developmentally, like they're already potty trained. Now 6 months later, they've regressed. Okay, what's going? It's just something that needs to be considered. I'm not saying that's always the answer, but whenever you see these like changes in behavior, just start to pay attention. Or if they say things like, "I don't like the games we play." Okay, show me what you play, what games, like instead of just saying, well, play another game or play nice or whatever, like, okay, we just have to take our kids seriously when they say, like, I don't want to go to daycare. Okay, like, what is that about? Like, just start paying attention. Is there a concern there? Like, spend 5 minutes saying, okay, tell me what you don't like about daycare, and again, back to this idea, teaching children about sexual boundaries, teaching children about that you have the right to say no, teaching children that if something doesn't feel right, talk to mommy and daddy about it. Teach your children that if a parent or adult or some other person tries to allow you to do things that we don't allow you to do, you need to tell us, right? Because they could be, just honestly, like, I don't think we need to scare children, but we do need to teach children, unfortunately, that not everybody that we think is good stays good. And that is what one of my books is about. So we did the Creating Personal Safety series. It's the unsafe neighbor, right? Like, he was a colleague of dad, and dad agrees to let him go away camping for a weekend, and then something happens, right? So even though dad thought he was safe, he wasn't. So teaching our kids these kind of things, and teaching them, that they can come forward and say something if and when something happens. But like, if you've got kids that are, the class clown is often a huge red flag, because that child may not be able to learn what they should be learning in school because they're so overwhelmed by their trauma memories. They may be using humor as a means to deflect from reality. Like, I don't want people to know that I don't know what's going on in math class, so I'm just going to disrupt math class and be the center of attention. Or, I'm not sleeping properly, I can't remember things, so easier just to disrupt the class than admit that I don't know or that I have a problem. Oftentimes it's a kid that's getting picked on because we talk about those lack of boundaries or DID. Trauma can make a child react in ways that don't make sense to anybody else unless you understand trauma, right? Like, if the child is being guarded or extra angry or pushing people away or extra needy or not dressing the way everybody else dresses based on their abuse experiences, that could cause them to get picked on. So, paying attention to these characteristics. If a kid's falling asleep in class, well, that could be because they don't feel safe to fall asleep at home. Yeah, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
How do parents, I mean, I felt like I couldn't tell my parents, right? And because we didn't talk about those things, and you mentioned this earlier, we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about this. I didn't feel like I could ever tell them what I was feeling or anything. And when it was happening, there was a altar boy that was found with a priest, and so I heard my parents talking about this. Everybody was talking about it in the neighborhood, and I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity. I've told this story before, for me to tell my story. And I come down the hallway and I hear my parents saying, well, he must have done something to make father do that with him. And then I just immediately turned around and said, okay, this is my
He's going
fault.
nowhere.
So what can parents do to say to their kids to set that? Because I didn't know what to do with my own kids. I had 4 kids and they're all grown now, but I didn't know what to say to them so that they felt always 100% comfortable to come forward to me if anything inappropriate ever happened.
First off, I'm sorry that happened. That makes me ill to think about that. A parent would say he must have did something to deserve it. That's awful. Sorry, what was your question? What should a
So
parent?
how do parents approach their kids so that their kids
Early.
know always that they can
Early.
come to them? Yeah.
Yeah. I would say early because shame is a learned thing, right? So if you teach children young about, if you teach children, for example, really young about masturbation and sexual intercourse and all those things, their response is going to be, yuck, why would people do that? Not, ooh, and oh, you're sick for telling me that, right? Like we have this emotional response because we know the emotions and stuff that are associated to those activities. But yeah, I would say teach them young. And another thing you could do, for example, when you understand the grooming process, we know that offenders will often allow the victims to do things that their parents won't. And I could see a child easily getting caught up in that, right? Because, they don't know the beginning from the end, so to speak. So I would say, like, you almost like have a code word or a secret with your child. Like if there's something that, you've done bad, remind me not to punish you because there's a bigger issue kind of thing, like we may have to address what you did, but that's not our top priority. The top priority is what happened to you, which is kind of the attitude I wish more police took when dealing with male survivors who may come across their paths in the line of duty, right? But yeah, I would say like, just making that message be really clear to the child that above everything else, if anything like this ever happens to you, I want you to be able to come talk to me, like in my book, The Unsafe Neighbor, for example, there's an image of, it's cartoon, but the cartoon character clearly has his hand inside the little boy's sleeping bag, right? And that's the only image that's portrayed, other than him with his big hairy chest. But, like the message is clear what's happening, right? So just letting kids know that, as weird as that might look to you, if that ever happens to you, you need to come tell mom and dad and you won't be in trouble, right? Like, if you, just like that, if this ever happens, this is the most important thing you need to tell us about, right? Like you need to tell us, I won't be mad. You're not going to be in trouble. No matter what you've done, you just need to tell us, right?
Yeah, and then, often, right? Probably more than once.
Yes.
You need to tell them that.
Yeah, and then you'd have to practice that grace too, right? Like if they say, Dad, I smoked weed with this guy and then he abused me, you're gonna have to bite the end of your tongue off and say, okay, I'm glad you came and told me that. I'm not thrilled that you smoked weed, but the more important issue is, this, and okay, and you deal with the abuse stuff, and then you talk about the, okay, how are you using this now, or what's going on in that department kind of thing, that's not what we want for you, that kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I would just echo that sentiment of kids watch how you act more than they hear what you say you do, or more than they hear what you say. And
Yeah.
I've experienced very much the same thing, Craig, where I had a professor and we were talking about Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court case. And he was saying all these things. And when I came out about my story, he was like, why didn't you tell me what had happened? And I told him, I was just like, I heard what you said. I saw the way you acted. And because it didn't match with the words you were saying, I didn't come to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's like such a big thing for parents to understand is you can say, I love you, I care for you, I'm compassionate towards your cause. No matter what you do, that's wrong, I'll be here for you. But if you see something on the news and you pop off on that person, you say, how could you be so stupid to ever get embroiled in such a situation? That person is so dumb, they are so depraved. Your kids hear that and they like take that.
Absolutely.
And like you said, it breeds that shame for them.
Absolutely. Or dad's laughing at the male rape jokes on TV, right? Drop the soap, right?
Yeah.
What does that do to your child who's been anally raped, right? I can't
And
tell my dad. He wouldn't understand. He thinks it's funny.
yeah, and
Oh, that's a good point.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's something that I've felt very fortunate about, that my parents have modeled that like a firm compassion, right? They're not going to be like, oh, like not that I did heroin, but they're like, oh, you did heroin. It's okay. We totally understand. There's circumstantial things that happen, but being like, we're not thrilled about this, but are you okay? Like where
Yeah, absolutely.
and
And such a good point too. I would say overall they have to leave this environment of safety and openness. Like it's safe to talk about these things. Like be open-minded yourself. And that is part of why I would like people just to read my book, because this is happening, right? Like be open-minded to the fact, like I was working with one police officer, for example, and he said he was trying to take a statement from a victim, and it was unfortunately a substance addict, and he was taking a statement from him, and his partners were like 100 feet away laughing, making jokes, like rape jokes or something. And I wanted to go report all those police, like just made me sick, right? Like, but the problem is it's because they don't believe it's possible. They don't think it's real. Not because they're horrible people, they just don't think it's real.
Yeah.
yeah,
Thankfully, I'm lecturing them all in November, so hallelujah.
yeah, they'll be learning lots of great things. Um, Doctor, it has been so amazing talking to you. We're so excited for all the work that you're doing, but could you tell us a little bit about all the work you're doing, your new book that's coming out, what some of your goals are for your future work, just so
Oh
we can be
man.
excited about it with you.
Cool. Yeah. So myself and the head of a youth treatment facility here in my area have put out the Creating Personal Safety series. So that is a children's series meant to educate parents and to help parents educate their children in a way that's like you were saying, like I didn't know what to say to my children, and you're, the experts in this field too, right? So we wrote some, but we spent like a couple months just brainstorming children's stories, ways we could. The first one is The Unsafe Neighbor. As I mentioned, it's just a story about a boy who gets lured in through dad's colleague who's just happened to be raising puppies, and hires him to help with the puppies, and all goes well for a few months or whatever, and then he hires him to come to the cabin. And the stories all have like good endings. Dad, this one in particular, dad had originally said, no, we can't get another puppy, we got a brand new baby, we can't handle another puppy. And then after this all comes out and the offender goes to jail, dad gets him the puppy. So it's got a good ending, and it's very little graphics, but the whole point is very clear. The other one, Positively Me, is just meant to help teach children that, you don't have to be scared to go to therapy. Good things come out of therapy. You can meet a therapy dog, that kind of thing. You can learn how to cope with strong emotions, that kind of stuff. And then third one, which I actually have a copy of the book here, Unfriend Her. This is my favorite out of all of them. It's meant to read to preteens or teens, just to teach them about human trafficking and how easy it is to get caught up in a bad situation where you're being exploited. So I'm writing, those are already out. They're on Amazon if anybody wants them. Thinking you guys probably will put a link in if you can. And then I'm, as I mentioned, the other book I'm hoping to finish in September. And then I don't know, after that I might take a break, but someday I do want to put out a workbook for male survivors too. So that's kind of half done, half not done. So yeah, I kind of want it. My book coach was saying, put this other book out first just to kind of build your platform a little more, and then come out with the male survivor workbook. So that's where I'm
Well,
at.
so what's your vision of success for Dr. Kelli Palfy? What's your end goal? What do you think when you accomplish this, you'll be like, okay, I've done what I needed to do. Is it?
Yeah. I feel like I'll probably be done after I can put out the Male Survivor workbook and a course, because I want to make it very affordable. Like I want it to be something that, psychologists could use or counselors could use with their clients, or clients could go through on their own. For example, if they don't have the means to afford a therapist, not everybody has that luxury, that they can still have access to treatment. And yeah, just people talking about it like you guys are, like that to me is success, right? And I'm not taking credit for that. I'm just saying, like, we're all playing our part, we're all doing our part. You guys get support and then you give support, right? So To me, that's success, honestly.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Lauren, and I want to thank you for joining our program today and for sharing the incredible work you've done and continue to do to help male survivors of sexual abuse. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was really great to be part of what you guys are doing. I'm so honored.
And for everyone watching, we hope you found this discussion enlightening. I hope you had some laughs, you took away some good notes, comforting, helpful to your healing process. Please go to our YouTube channel, all the major podcast sites for this program, as well as other programs from Voices Beyond Assault.
Yes, and please send us your comments or leave your comments on this site. We really do value your input. There will be other information at the end of this program on Dr. Kelli Palfy's books and how to get a hold of her and her website, which has lots of great information. So please check that out as well, whether you're on YouTube or on one of the podcast sites, that information will be there. Thanks again to all of you survivors out there for your continued support of programs and organizations such as Voices Beyond Assault. It's your courage that gives us strength. We'd like to thank all of you for joining our program today and hope you found the information useful and helpful. For more information about this and other programs from Voices Beyond Assault, please visit our website at voicesbeyondassault.org. We also invite you to subscribe to this podcast or our video version on YouTube. Thank you again, and remember, together we heal.
Hiding it in his hands made me say, am I